Hi, everyone, and welcome to this panel of our virtual Six Bridges Book Festival, and thank you for joining us. I'm Sarah Orsborn. I'm an Arkansas native. I am a former CALS intern way back in the day, and I'm now joining you from Denver, Colorado. We are going to have a great discussion today, but before I introduce you to our author, let me get a housekeeping item out of the way. If you'd like to ask a question during the session, just open the chat box and you can put it right in the chat. And I'll be keeping an eye on it and try to ask as many as I can. You can also find a link to purchase Amanda's book in the chat, which I'm sure you'll want to do if you haven't already. And I'm excited to start our discussion. Today I have the pleasure to present to you Amanda LeDuc. She's a disability rights advocate and the author of Disfigured on Fairy Tales, Disability, and Making Space. She's also the author of the novel The Miracles of Ordinary Men, published in 2013, and her new novel, The Centaur's Wife, is forthcoming in spring 2021. Her essays and stories have appeared in LitHub, The Rumpus, Little Fiction Big Truths, The National Post, Open Book Ontario, and other publications across Canada, the US, and the UK. She was born in British Columbia. She has lived in Ontario, England, British Columbia, and Scotland, and she has cerebral palsy and presently makes her home in Hamilton, Ontario, where she lives with a lovable and destructive dog and serves as the Communications and Development Coordinator for the Festival of Literary Diversity, Canada's first festival for diverse authors and stories. So she's a true literary festival pro, and I'm very excited to welcome her. Amanda, we're so glad you're here.
Oh, thank you so much, Sarah. It's lovely to be here. I'm so excited for our conversation today.
We were going to start with a reading, if you'd like to jump into that.
Sure.
Also, this is the book, everyone.
So for those who maybe aren't aware, this is my latest book, Disfigured on Fairy Tales, Disability, and Making Space. And it was published by Coach House Books in Toronto in Canada earlier this year in February. And it's essentially a nonfiction look at fairy tales and disability and the ways that those narratives have contributed to the way that we view disabled people and have viewed disabled people in narratives and in real life. And it's also a bit of a memoir talking about my own experience with cerebral palsy. I'm just going to read a little bit from the beginning. It begins, as all fairy tales do, with a problem. Once upon a time, a woodcutter and his wife lived alone and had no children. Once upon a time, a wealthy man's wife died and he was lonely, so he married another woman who was cruel to his child. Once upon a time, a mermaid, looking out beyond the sea, longed to find herself walking on land. In this case, a mother and father have a 17-month-old daughter who has not yet learned to walk. This is not always a problem. Some children walk sooner while others take their time, but these parents are worried. They read the literature on standard milestones and ask questions of the doctors, who tell them not to worry. They whisper the same thing to themselves and each other at night. Don't worry, everything will be okay. They've already lost a child, another daughter, dark-haired and silent, who came into the world already dead. It happened a year and a half before their second daughter was born. Her ashes sit in a little gray box on their bedroom closet shelf. They are terrified, but also filled with hope. Sometimes it can take a while, they remind themselves. Every child is different. Their second daughter's other milestones are fine. She laughs, she cries, she crawled with no trouble. She eats anything and everything they put in front of her. When she does take her first steps, just before turning 2, they are overjoyed but still worried. Their daughter's right foot turns inward so that her right leg collapses against the left. She doesn't drag it, not exactly, but the way that she walks doesn't look quite right. There are no mentions of this in their baby information books, no pictures of a leg that slants just so. They take her to the doctor, who agrees that something doesn't look the way it should. More than this, though, the doctor trusts them, believes them, understands the dark river of uncertainty that flows deep within a parent. I listen to the mothers, she tells them. They always know. She refers them to a neurologist who sends them to another city an hour's drive away, so that doctors can put the girl into a machine and look at her brain. And I'll stop there so we can get to the question part of the day.
Okay. So the book beautifully braids together the story of your disabled identity and kind of how you grapple with that as you go from childhood to adulthood, as well as analysis of um, fairy tales. And I like that you start the story like a fairy tale in that way, and also that the genesis of the story, much like a fairy tale, started in a forest. Can you tell us about what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah. So about 2 years ago, in the summer, or 2.5 years ago, in the summer of 2018, I had the extraordinary good fortune to participate in Hedgebrook, which is a writing retreat for women and women identifying writers, located off the coast of Seattle on Whidbey Island. And I was working on a novel, the novel that's actually coming out in February of next year. And I was having a tough time with it, so I went for a walk through the forest. Hedgebrook has these lovely cottages that are just sort of spaced out on this farm, and there are all these hiking trails that you can go down. And there was a walking stick that you had at your cottage, so I took my walking stick and walked through the forest for a little bit. And I have cerebral palsy. It's quite mild. I have a limp and weakness on my right side, but I can do most things. So walking through the forest wasn't difficult for me. You know, I had to be careful of where I put my feet and whatnot. But one of the things I noticed was that using the walking stick made things quite a bit easier for me. And I thought, oh, you know, that's interesting. Maybe I should think about using a cane in real, well, not real life, but outside of this idyllic retreat in which I found myself. And as I was walking, I was thinking about how, you know, we often don't associate the forest with disability, because forests are notoriously inaccessible to people, especially those with physical disabilities, right? I mean, the ground is usually very uneven. It's you can't really get, you know, a wheelchair down a forest path unless it's specifically been cleared and made suitable for that purpose. And I was thinking about how magical forests were, but, you know, they kept disability out. But then I was thinking, actually, you know, in a lot of the stories that we associate with forests, i.e. fairy tales, disability is very much a part of those tales, even though we don't necessarily think of it that way. And it hit me all of a sudden. And I was thinking, you know, about Beauty and the Beast and Cinderella and, you know, Sleeping Beauty, thinking about Hansel and Gretel, you know, stories like Rumpelstiltskin and all these characters that are disabled. They are disabled people in these stories, but we never think of them as disabled because they're either painted as villains or they're painted as essentially temporarily disabled, and they need to, you know, complete some sort of quest or display good behavior in order to reach a happy ending, which involves not being disabled anymore. And I was really struck by that similarity. And so I thought, okay, well, maybe there's an essay in this that I can, you know, explore this topic. Because I sort of assumed, it hit me all at once, and it seems so obvious. It was one of those things that you're like, well, obviously this has been written about tons of times before, because the connection just seems so clear all of a sudden. And I went home after the retreat and, you know, started thinking about this essay and doing some research, and there actually wasn't a lot. There is some work in the academic realm. One of the scholars that I cite, Anne Schmiesing, in the book, she has a lovely book specifically about disability in the Brothers Grimm fairy tales in particular. But there wasn't a lot in the realm of sort of pop culture, sort of wider cultural parlance. So the essay just started getting bigger, and then eventually it became a book. And, you know, lucky for me, Coach House Books in Toronto decided that, you know, they would love to publish it. So it was a nice little story within a story, you know, how the book came together. It does, you're right, it does have a little bit of a fairy tale feel to it in itself.
Yeah, I thought that was great the way that you crafted that. And so this is the work that came out like between your two novels. Was it a different process for you writing a work of nonfiction and cultural criticism?
Yeah. I feel like I'm going to jinx myself by saying this, but I definitely felt that writing nonfiction was easier than fiction. Which is not to say that writing nonfiction in general is easier than fiction. I don't think that's the case. I think it just so happened that this particular story it just was, I was telling it at the right time for myself. You know, I had sort of come to a point of being really comfortable with myself as a disabled woman and comfortable with that journey. So it was something that was very easy to put down on paper. And also the research side of it was really fascinating, like to go into the history of fairy tales and, you know, look at the ways that historically fairy tales have talked about society and, you know, touched on a whole bunch of different things apart from disability. It was just really, really interesting. And I know when I write fiction, there's always a point where, you know, I sort of get bogged down in what the plot requires. And it's like, well, you know, what the heck happens now? I have no idea. And whenever I got stuck doing that in a nonfiction, I could always go back to the research, right? And go down another little rabbit hole of trying to figure something out. And inevitably that new rabbit hole would lead me to another touch-off point of something that I could talk about. So it was really, you know, it was really a pleasant experience writing Disfigured. It came together really quickly. And it just kind of, it felt, the process of writing it felt very organic. And, you know, writing both of the novels that I've worked on to date has not been a similar experience. So, I mean, maybe it's just Disfigured. Maybe Disfigured was just a good experience for me. And the next nonfiction project that I write will be terrible in terms of like the process of going through it. But one can hope that, you know, maybe the next experience will be likewise as joyous.
So the book talks about both fairy tales in their original like oral and written form, and like the Brothers Grimm and the early French fairy tales and things like that, as well as more modern adaptations such as Disney films and even superhero stories. What are the basic boundaries for what makes a fairy tale a fairy tale?
Mm-hmm. So fairy tales are distinguished from things like myths and legends insofar as they've always sort of been known as fiction from beginning to end. So whereas, you know, a myth or a legend, there's sort of an understanding that that myth or legend has a historical basis somewhere, even if the story itself has kind of grown, you know, beyond all of that. Fairy tales, it's always, you know, once upon a time in a land far, far away, leading right up to happily ever after, right? And in terms of the structure of them themselves, it, you know, usually there is a problem at the beginning that needs to be solved in some way. And fairy tales either end happily for all involved, except for the villain. You know, usually the villain gets their just desserts. Or fairy tales don't end happily. And usually when they don't end happily, it's because they are some sort of cautionary tale for, you know, especially because they were tales that were used often to instruct children. When you look at something like the Brothers Grimm, you know, it's right there in the title of their book was Children's and Household Tales. And their idea in writing and collecting these stories was essentially to teach children how to behave. So that's why in the Brothers Grimm stories in particular, you have a lot of stories that are very spiritual in nature. They're very, very strict in terms of like very kind of God-fearing, and, you know, this is what happens to good people and this is what happens to bad people, and you want to do X, Y, and Z in order to be a good person in life. So they're very sort of, I mean, fairy tales I don't think are simple at all, but they do have a very sort of simplistic veneer at the outset where it's, you know, this is beginning, middle, end, the story goes this way, and usually there's a happy ending, right? Which is part of why I think they work so well as stories for children, because they're very easily contained. It's, you know, princess meets prince, they fall in love, they get married. It's one of, you know, the super simplistic versions of that sort of thing. Or, you know, young, down on his luck man undergoes a series of adventures and then marries the princess at the end, or marries his sweetheart at the end and becomes a rich man, right? Like there's a progression from beginning, going through some sort of trial, and then attaining happiness, attaining wealth and riches, often, more often than not, at the end. And I think as much as people often say fairy tales are just for children, that is especially in Western culture, I think in North American culture in particular, that's a formula that has really woven itself in deeply into the media that we consume. Especially when you look at things like Hollywood and Disney, right? Like there's very much a trend toward the happy ending in movies, which I think is very much a fairy tale influence.
For sure. Are fairy tales ever just stories?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm biased because I love stories, right? And I love picking things out of stories and using them as instructions, not necessarily for how people should behave, but ways of looking at human behavior and illuminating certain social expectations. One of the things that's been really interesting in the course of, or was really interesting in the course of writing the book and researching fairy tales, was looking at how fairy tales are very much a product of the cultures in which they arise, right? So in France, the fairy tale sort of started as we know it in Italy, and then it moved to France. And it was sort of coming about in France at the same time as there was a rising class of women who, would hold these salons where women would get together and they would tell these stories. And the idea was to embellish the stories using as highfalutin language as possible. And that's where you get this sort of rise of the literary style of the fairy tale. But for me, it was interesting because in those stories, those folk tales that those women were telling and retelling and embellishing, they would swap out, traditional patriarchal versions of authority. So like the church or the priest, and they would take those out and then they would put in a wise woman or a fairy godmother or things like that. So there was a real kind of sense of, in this particular case, women were coming more to the forefront and really wanting to have more of a grasp of power in society. And they were using these sort of innocuous fairy tale stories that, nobody was really paying attention to as a way of doing this, right? And so in this way, fairy tales can be very subversive and can really, they're not just stories, they're things that people carry with them all throughout their lives. And in that sense, I still think they have a great deal of power. I mean, I wrote a whole book about how, they have power in very, in many cases, sometimes damaging ways. And at the same time, I think there is room for them to just be stories as well, right? Like, I don't think, despite the fact that they can be very problematic, I don't think there's anything wrong with enjoying fairy tales as just stories, as a form of escape. But it's also important, I think, to look at them, right, and engage with that material and really stop to think about what it says about society, especially when it comes to the depiction of, disability and the depictions of the villains in fairy tales. Like, is it fair that someone like Rumpelstiltskin is, shunned and laughed at and essentially made to become evil by virtue of the fact of how society treats him? Is it fair that the Beast in Beauty and the Beast is made ugly, quote unquote, because he has, a bad temper or is seen to be ugly on the inside? What does that then say for people who maybe are not conventionally attractive, right? Like, is the opposite true for them, that their, insides are not, they're not good people because their outer countenance sort of gives face to that. And, these are all things that I think is really important to think about as people telling stories to kids and people, adults sharing stories amongst ourselves, especially as I've talked about, given that so many of these stories are things that we tell and retell in different ways in mainstream media and culture. It's really important to enjoy the stories, but also interrogate them at the same time.
Sure. So sometimes fairy tales could be subversive, even sort of feminist, if you think about the early French women writers, which is fascinating because I think a lot of feminists today are like, princesses are bad for women. Was the subversive nature ever extended to the disabled characters? Did they ever get to subvert norms?
I mean, I would say no. I'm not, the book was sort of a mixture, right, of cultural criticism and memoir. So I would not classify it as fairy tale scholarship. I would never want to be out here making, these grand pronouncements about fairy tales when, like, there are many people who are much more knowledgeable about fairy tales than I am in particular. Having said that, I think when it comes to the depictions of disability, especially in the fairy tales that we know in Western culture, the ones that are most familiar to us, I don't really think there has been any kind of subversion where that's concerned. I do think there are newer stories that are coming out now, usually by disabled authors who are sort of reinventing those tropes and looking at those stories anew. But usually, in the stories that I read in the course of doing my research and looking at the ones that, Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella and Beauty and the Beast and all the ones that we sort of, the kind of core group of the ones that we know and love, the depiction of disability is kind of the same in all of them, right? It's either a problem to be overcome or it's visited on someone as punishment. It's something that they deserve as a result of bad behavior. You look at something like Cinderella in the Brothers Grimm version of the tale, the stepsisters have their eyes pecked out by doves at the end for how horrible they behave with Cinderella. And they also, in the course of trying to go after the prince, the one stepsister, I think, lops off her toe to try and fit her foot into the slipper, and then the other one cuts off a piece of her heel. And the idea there is that, they are so depraved and such terrible people that they don't think twice about maiming themselves or disfiguring themselves in order to attain this end, right? And that it says a lot without saying it at all, if you know what I mean. And I really hope that, again, we start to interrogate these tales and tell them in different ways and look at how we can center disability in positive ways in stories like this, so that people understand that, you don't need to be made able-bodied in order to obtain a happy ending.
Most of the fairy tales in the book are familiar. I mean, I'm a girl in America who also grew up on Disney, but some of them I had never heard of before. Can you tell us about maybe a lesser known fairy tale that you feature in your book?
So one of the prominent ones that I talk about is a book or a tale, again by the Brothers Grimm. They had many tales, called The Maiden Without Hands. And it's another one of their sort of overtly religious tales. And it's about a woman who, at the beginning of the tale, the devil cuts her hands off, and she goes out into the world and sort of subsists on charity with her hands tied to her back, comes to a kingdom through one adventure after another, falls in love with the king. They get married. He gives her a pair of silver hands that she can use in place of her real ones. And then the idea is that the devil is trying to one-up the maiden and comes to the kingdom and the king goes off to war, and then the woman, the queen, is sort of cast out by her mother-in-law who distrusts her, and the woman is made to wander the forest again. That sort of the 7 years, the magical 7 years that is often talked about in fairy tales in terms of the length of time. She wanders the forest for 7 years and then comes across a cottage where an angel of God is standing there, and the angel welcomes her into the cottage, and she lives there for another 7 years with her son. And then the king, who has returned from war and found out that his wife has been sent away, eventually goes off searching for them, and it's another 7 years before they're reunited. And at the end of that tale, her hands have grown back as a reward for her faith, which is again an interesting way for the Brothers Grimm to, insert a little bit of like expectation in there, right? Like, this is, yes, a fairy tale, but if you're pious, if you're a good person, good things will come to you in the end, no matter what trials you undergo over the course of your life. And it's very interesting to me. It's so many fairy tales, especially so many of the lesser known ones that haven't been, Disneyfied and prettied up and written about in bright colors, are so terrible.
Yeah, like, you can't make a movie out of the maiden.
No, you really can't. I mean, she gets her hands chopped off like right at the beginning of the story, and is walking around with her severed hands tied to her back, and this is just a thing that you accept because you're in fairy tale land. So that one was kind of like the main one that it sort of imprinted on me now. It has such power too, because there's a kind of yearning in there, right, for that goodness, for wanting to return to a life that's unspoiled, quote unquote. And I find that really compelling.
It's interesting to me. I feel like the fairy tales can only envision of a happy ending that involves healing of some sort. Whereas I feel like disability justice is about wholeness, even if healing never comes, right? Like not seeing the maiden as less than before her hands are restored.
Right.
Because she has a son and she has a happy life with him. And why isn't that a happy enough ending?
She also has, she was given silver prosthetic hands by the king, which apparently worked just fine, right? And yet, again, that she is not whole unless unless the prosthetics are done away with and she has her quote unquote real hands come back. It's very, very interesting, because these are things that, people take for granted so much. It's just like, oh, well, obviously she would prefer to have her real hands as opposed to her prosthetic hands. And people really don't think about what kind of messages. I mean, they certainly weren't thinking about that kind of message back in the 19th century when the tales were written, for sure. But even now, when we retell these stories and think about them from that perspective, people really need to think about what this does and says to people, right? It's just like it is an entire rabbit warren, right? You go down one rabbit hole with one fairy tale and it leads you to another, and it's just disability narrative after disability narrative after like questionable representation. It's very fascinating and also kind of troubling at the same time. And I think it's really heartening to see more writers coming out now and talking about disability stories, talking about disability fairy tales, and disability in the comic book universe and all those kinds of things. Because I think what's key is that all of these stories, for a large majority of the time, haven't actually been written by disabled characters or disabled people at all, right? They've always been written by non-disabled writers who, for whatever reason, viewed disability in very particular ways.
Fascinating to learn that one of the brothers Grimm had a heart condition, but that in a way it spurred him to almost make more ableist stories.
Yes. I mean, and that was it was Wilhelm who had a heart condition, and he took over more of the editing of the books and subsequent editions of the Brothers Grimm stories. And you can see a heightened focus on disability in the stories after he took over the editing of them. And that's called narrative prosthesis, where you have a character who is made more disadvantaged at the beginning of the story because they're disabled, which means that they then have more to gain by the end of the story if they are also made able-bodied by the end of things. And it's interesting to me because I think, Wilhelm Grimm talked a lot about his disability and how it impacted his life and how he was, thankful for the small gifts of his life. But you're right, that sort of ableist underpinning, that sort of sense, because they were both very religious, the sense of, God has visited this disability upon me, and I either sort of put up with it and understand that God will take it away if and when he so chooses, or, try and fill my life full of good deeds in order that this disability may go away at some point. And that, is a whole other sort of kettle of fish, I think, in terms of, disability, in terms of spiritual understanding, which is also related to how we depict disability in fairy tales, right? I mean, biblical interpretations of disability and parables about disability are very different things from fairy tales, but still there's that sense, right, of being broken and then being made whole. And what does that do to the ways that we operate in the world today, you know, understanding these kinds of narratives and yearning for that kind of, I mean, being told, you know, the concept of brokenness to begin with, right? Like if your body does not look a certain way, it's just sort of assumed that you are broken and that you should be made whole through virtue of prayer or through virtue of good exercise, or, you know, all of the many things that disabled people are often told to do in order to eradicate their disability, without looking at and understanding that the disabled person is a whole person and, you know, they're not broken, there's nothing wrong with them.
I think able-bodied people really struggle to understand that there are people with disabilities who don't wish their disability away, would not want that even if it came up. I feel like that really came up for me this week, seeing the Nobel Prize be awarded to the 2 women who worked on CRISPR, because on the one hand, you see the medical community celebrating this as a potential end to genetic diseases one day. But then I see members of the disability community, like Rebecca Coakley, talking about the little people community, or people talking about the deaf community, seeing this as having the potential to eradicate a people with a culture. And it seemed to me that the scientific thinking and the fairy tale thinking are really not far off from each other in that realm.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's also interesting because, you know, you have, and I'm going to pronounce her name wrong because I always pronounce it wrong, Louise, it's not Gluck, right?
I think it's like a German U sound in there somehow.
Right. Who was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature earlier this past week. You know, and she's a wonderful writer, and she has an extraordinary body of work. And, you know, she wrote a poem, you know, The Cripple on the Subway, which is all about, you know, envisioning life in a disabled body, and the disabled protagonist of that poem and that narrative. It's all about, you know, the accident that made her body the way that it is, and thinking about her life before the accident and focusing on the accident. And that poem was written quite a few decades ago, but how do we continue to, you know, depict disability as this kind of, again, this brokenness, this sense of like, oh, isn't it so sad that this body is disabled, or this body is different from other bodies? This is, you know, the helpless and the loveless, and the, you know, the disabled body is perceived of in very particular, less than spectacular ways. And that is something that we continue to perpetuate when we tell stories about disabled people that don't center disabled people, don't center disabled authors themselves. And it's really something that, you know, even I, as a disabled woman, I wasn't thinking about it in these terms, you know, as recently as 5 years ago. It's really kind of taken a while for me to understand how crucial it is that we, understand that disabled stories and disability stories are not just for the disabled population. Like, they're stories for everybody. Everybody can benefit from reading them. And also, it's really important that we give disabled people the opportunity to tell their own stories themselves, and that we stop, as we so often do, giving space to non-disabled people to tell disabled stories.
We had a question in the chat about whether there are any authors writing modern fairy tales or rewriting old ones with the intent to change, you know, the view in the story and in society, and if there are any recommendations you could give in that area.
So there's an anthology called Unbroken, which Unbroken, 13 stories starring disabled teens, which is written by disabled writers, and featuring different disabled characters in various ways, some of which are fairy tale inspired. There are writers like Leah Bardugo. I'll try and put all these in the chat. And there's a writer named Elsa Hunison, who's based in Seattle, who does a lot of work in the science fiction and fantasy realm. She does a lot of editing. She has a memoir, Alone in the Light, I believe it's called, that's going to be coming out next year, about her life as a deafblind woman. I think also what's been key for me in terms of learning more about the disability community and the different stories that are out there are places like Twitter and Instagram, and following disabled people on Twitter in particular, and looking at the different conversations that people are having, the different kinds of works that people are celebrating. One of the things that we often talk about in the literary community is the importance of own voices, right? So stories that are written by members of a particular marginalized community themselves. And in the disability community, it can be really tricky because, you have a book that, for example, if I, as someone with cerebral palsy, was to write a book about someone featuring a main character that had that was autistic, right? That would not be an own voices disabled story, even though I am a disabled writer, because I would be writing about an experience, about a disability that's not my own. So I think it's really important to be seeking out and looking for own voices stories in the disability community in particular. I do think it's important for disability representation just across the board. Like, I think this is something that, we should be encouraging people to read stories with disability representation, but also above and beyond that, really seeking out own voices disabled creators. And you can Google like disability and fairy tales, disabled authors, and there's a whole bunch of names that will come up. And that discussion of own voices disability representation does come up a lot. It's definitely, a hashtag that if you're not following it on Twitter already, you should. I recommend it. Hashtag own voices.
What does a happy ending look like to you now, as opposed to the types of fairy tales happy endings that we're told to want?
Mm-hmm. So I am a huge romantic, and I was really captivated when I was younger with this idea of, the romantic happy ending, right? Like meeting your prince and falling in love and getting married and all those kinds of things. And I think for a really long time, I tied a very particular kind of happiness to that, a very particular kind of self-worth for myself, with this idea of being, attractive to somebody and being able to be in love with somebody as being indicative of my worth as a person. And, it's taken, I'm 38 now. It's taken pretty much 38 years to get to the point of realizing that, it sounds like a cliche, but it's really important it has been really important for me to be that person, to be my own happily ever after at the end of the day, like to recognize that my life is not, my life has been shaped by my disability. And instead of looking for someone who will love me in spite of my disability as a happy ending, what I actually want is, for myself to be that person who loves myself as much as I deserve, and gives myself the confidence to go out into the world and to do all of the things that I want to do. And whether or not a romantic happy ending, will come over and above that would be great. But it's not, as central to the idea of a happy ending as it was, 5-10 years ago for me. And that's been really interesting. One of the great things about writing Disfigured was that it was almost like Disfigured was kind of a happy ending in a way, because I had to, I really had to return to that small girl that I was, who got made fun of in school because of the way that she walked, and, carried all of these hurts with her for a really long time and kind of ran away from them. Like I really didn't, I because my disability is mild and because sometimes I can pass as able-bodied, I really tried for a long time to pretend like I didn't have a disability. And it wasn't until I came full circle and faced what it meant to occupy a disabled body and to be disabled and to sort of, reckon with that and embrace that part of myself again, that happy ending really came into play. So taking the narrative and reworking it for myself has really been powerful. And also, at the beginning of the book, in that introduction, I talk about going away on that writing retreat and struggling with that novel. And the thing that's been so interesting for me is that novel took 5 years to write, And it wasn't until I'd written Disfigured that everything that I needed to know for the novel fell into place. It was like Disfigured came out, and then all of a sudden, oh, look, it's like this magic box that you just unlocked, and everything that you need for your novel is right there. So it just, there is something that feels very magical about it to me, because I feel like it all sort of had to happen this way. You know, I needed to go on these sorts of fairy tale quests in this very particular kind of manner.
It was your hero's journey.
Yeah, it was my hero's journey. And you know, the hero at the beginning, middle, and end has always sort of been myself, which sounds really egotistical and terrible, but it, you know, I think I was always looking for a hero to save me. And I think we often, you know, especially as disabled people, we're taught as a society to be looking for the hero, right? Who will come up with the cure to eradicate disability, or will, you know, come up with some sort of magical thing that will make disability go away and make it so that it's no longer society's responsibility for us to look after one another, and to really kind of work together to envision and create a world where everybody can thrive regardless of the bodies that they occupy.
It also seemed to me a little bit that there is a love story in the story, but it's a love story with the disabled community. Mm-hmm. That then becomes the love and the warmth surrounding that Genesis is a new and better world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I thought that was powerful too.
Yeah, I mean, it has meant so much to me to find community in the disabled community, to find community in the CP, the cerebral palsy community, you know, to have friends who walk in similar ways to the way that I do, or, you know, to have people who have CP be able to see, even just by the way that I walk, be like, oh yes, you have CP too. It sounds strange, but there's a real sense of kinship in recognizing that you move differently from other people, but then that also puts you closer to these other people who are likewise different in certain particular ways. And that's been it's meant so much to me to find that community. And over and above that, to just find the disability community in general, and to look at the ways that people are revisioning the world in which we live, and imagining places that are better, imagining people that are better. It's been really, you know, I mean, inspiration, it's such a loaded term, but it's been really inspiring for me to see how the disabled community really lifts one another up, and how that can act as a model for, you know, communities outside of the disability community to lift one another up, and to lift each other up, and do all this sort of cross community work of just imagining what a new world could look like.
Have modern adaptations of fairy tales done any better? Toward the end of the book, you moved toward talking about shows like Once Upon a Time and even superhero stories. And I know we have someone in the chat interested in the superhero comics and stories and how they play into it. So as we've moved into like the Marvel has now become the Disney princesses.
Yeah.
The other side of the coin, right? In terms of the merch juggernaut and
yeah,
cranking them out. Have they done better?
I mean, I think comic books, you know, I'm definitely not a comic book aficionado. You know, I love Marvel and I love the movies, but I don't know as much about it as other people do. I think you're right. I think they are definitely occupying that Disney princesses space now, and, you know, will for the foreseeable future. I mean, there's a whole new slate of movies planned, right? And I think for me, what's interesting with the Marvel and the superhero, the DC question in particular, is that, you know, these characters are also often disabled in very particular ways. But then there's also like another sense that kind of comes in, not in all cases, obviously, but you look at someone like Daredevil, right? Who is blind, but then, or wait, am I getting... No, sorry, for a second I was like, Daredevil and Deadpool are the same. No, they're not the same. Daredevil, you know, he's blind, but then he's, you know, he's got these amplified other senses, which, interestingly, goes back to the compensation theory, which is something that the Brothers Grimm often talked a lot about, right? Which went back to their faith in God, where it was like, if you are disabled in one particular sense, your other senses will, come together and magnify in order to make up for that lack. If you can't see, your hearing will become essentially supersonic as a result of this, which will enable you to move throughout the world. And we know that's false. We know now that does not happen. The fact that you may have to rely on other senses more because one sense is diminished doesn't necessarily mean that your capacities have somehow become more powerful or something like that. But anyway, with the comic book thing, I think it's interesting in that instead of disabilities being eradicated, you have characters who are living with their disabilities in very particular ways. And the whole idea of, the mutants with, something like the X-Men, the idea of mutants as being outcast in society is very interesting and very powerful to me. I think this is all very interesting and really moving farther away from that idea of disability as weakness, as something that should be shunned and not talked about. But there are also, ways that I think that the comic book industry and those kinds of stories could also still improve. There's, this still a very particular idea of what strength means in comic book stories. It's often equated with physical strength. Again, not always, there's always exceptions. But, what does strength mean? And what does it, in the real world, the non-superhero world in which we live, how do we create these kinds of narratives and this kind of equality and this kind of inclusion in ways that don't rely on, oh, well, imagine what it was like if you were a superhero, or pretend that you're like so and so in the Marvel universe. I think we need to understand the power in these stories, but also use that power as ways of revisioning the world in which we live. And that is a collective effort. The thing with superheroes is that, there's this idea that the regular population relies on the power of another individual to fix these kinds of outside problems. And really, it's society's problem. It's all of our responsibilities to fix these kinds of things.
Gotham City could have really done some community cleanup, and then they wouldn't have needed Batman.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's see. Thinking about the way the community can do better, and since your part of the title is about making space, how can able-bodied people make space for people with disabilities and be good allies to people with disabilities?
So I think the main thing, I mean, there's so many things, but I think one of the most important things is really to listen and to ensure that the non-disabled people are not talking over disabled people. One of the things that I have noticed again and again and again since, essentially coming out as a disability advocate and talking about it publicly in my own work is that, often I will talk about, myself as a disabled writer or a disabled person, and I will get someone in my comments or someone writing me emails and being like, it's person with a disability. Like, you should just really, think about your language. And, that's frustrating because I think people who say that to me, often I think are not listening to the disability community themselves, because the disability community has been quite vocal about the fact that, we often prefer identity first language as opposed to person first language. And to see people, again, often non-disabled people coming in and being like, well, that's not how you should treat disabled people or people with disabilities. This is what you should do, and this is what you should say, and this is not appropriate for you to say. And there's no sort of sense of self-awareness there. And I think people really do have good intentions where these kinds of things are concerned. But, that goes back to thinking of the disabled community and disabled people as not able to speak for themselves, which is kind of what has happened, for time out of mind. And with the advent of things like social media and websites and blogging and the sort of way that the internet has been able to connect so many of us, there's really no excuse anymore for someone who is not disabled to really think that they know or can speak with any kind of authority about the disability community. I think it's really important that if you're on Twitter, that you're following disability activists, that you're reading books by disabled writers, and just, participating in the conversation by being an active listener. When I, first started my own work in disability activism, I'd say probably the first year of it was really just being on Twitter and following a whole bunch of disability activists. And I didn't even engage with them in conversation until later. That first year was really just about listening. What are things that are important to people? That was how I found out about the straw bans and the whole, focus on how that can be really detrimental to the disability community in particular. So I would really recommend that as a starting point, like follow disabled activists, listen to them, listen to what they have to say. And then, reach out in ways, ask how you can help, and be prepared for someone to say, the way that you help is by just sort of, stepping back from the limelight and really looking for other voices to uplift. One of the things that I have, because I've given workshops and talked about how to accurately and appropriately put disability in your writing. And one of the things that sometimes gets brought up is people saying, well, I've heard about this particular story, which I find really engaging and really, heart-wrenching, and I really want it to go out into the world. Because this disability or, XYZ is not often talked about. And it's like, well, have you thought of approaching someone who has that disability, or looking for writers or people who are out in the community already who have those disabilities themselves? Are you uplifting their voices? Are you trying to, ensure that they have a platform and they have spaces in which to speak? I think in terms of a writer's perspective, anybody can write whatever kinds of stories they want, but the question of whether you should write something is quite different from whether you can write something. And, we should be listening, we should be uplifting other voices as much as possible. And from there, we will get more ideas about where to go and how to be better allies. And it's always a process of growing too, right? We all, make mistakes. I continue to make mistakes, and I will continue to make mistakes throughout my whole life as a disability advocate, and the idea of disability and disability activism, I think, also changes. So, what was maybe acceptable 10 years ago is, we're maybe speaking in different ways now. And that is, growth and progress, and that's natural. And so I think it can be difficult in the sort of hyper public world of the internet for people to make those kinds of mistakes publicly. But I think we just need to give space for ourselves and for others who want to be allies to really learn and grow.
Someone else mentioned audiobooks and things like that in the chat, and I did want to point out that your book is special in that it came out in many accessible formats all at once, correct?
It did, yeah. So it was the first book published in Canada to come out simultaneously in, I think, 6 accessible formats, which was so great. And it's also available through, I think it's Bookshare in the US, which they have accessible versions of books as well. So it's available through that platform. And that was really, really great because accessible versions of books often aren't made until after a book has been out for 6 months or 7 months or so. So it can be really hard if you're someone who has print disabilities in particular to be excited about a book that you hear is coming out and then realize that it's publication date comes and goes, and you can't actually still access the book because it's only available in print or only available in print and audiobook, and maybe you're someone who needs to have a EPUB version that you can change the size of the text or things like that. So that was a really interesting journey. I'm also hopeful that my next book, so the novel that's coming out in February in Canada, is going to be published in print, ebook, and audiobook. And then I think we're also going to be publishing it in a couple of other accessible formats as well. So I'm excited for that too.
And your next book features majority or entirely disabled characters, is that correct?
Entirely disabled characters, yeah. Also centaurs.
Centaurs. See, we're getting another one to add to the list of the
exactly
fantasy.
Unfortunately, it doesn't have a US publication date yet, or a US publisher. So if anybody knows of a publisher who would like to take on a weird centaur novel, it's up for grabs.
Awesome. Well, we're down to our last 5 minutes, so I thought I would see if anybody has not put a question in the chat, but has a question that you would like to ask. Now is your last 5 minutes to do so, so take advantage. And let's see. I thought it was interesting, the beauty in the Beauty and the Beast story. I didn't realize that Beast was also characterized as stupid. Mm-hmm. In the original story, so it was like he was doubly disabled, and they left that out of the main one, and where in Disney, where he's this man with a library, and that's kind of how he bonds with Belle.
With a library and a very fashionable suit jacket.
Yes, he had a very good Beast tailor.
Yeah, he really did. Which, I can't remember in the Disney film. Are his clothes torn at the end after his transformation, or do they just sort of magically shrink the way?
I think he just magically has on a nice outfit that fits his tiny body. It's kind of like how the Incredible Hulk's shorts somehow always stay on.
So true. Continuity problem.
It's like the growing and shrinking. They didn't bother to fit. It's just really good spandex.
Yep.
Well, if nobody has any questions, I think I'm about done as well. So I'll just go ahead and close, and you can add into the chat those resources and authors that you were wanting to recommend, and I'll wrap up here.
Sorry, Sarah, just before you go, can I just say, I noticed Kevin Brockmeyer's name there. So Kevin, I just wanted to say thank you so much because you were the one who invited me to Six Bridges initially. And I'm so thankful for the experience and really a huge lover of your work as well. So that was so lovely to get an email from you in my inbox, and it was just very magical. So thank you for all of that.
He says maybe in person eventually. I hope for all of us.
Yes. Fingers crossed.
Well, thank you for everyone joining us. Please remember that you can buy Amanda's book. There's a link if you scroll up to the top of the chat. You can buy the book. It's super easy. You can also check out the Six Bridges Book Festival site to see what other events are coming up during the fest that you'd like to get involved in. And you can find a link to Amanda's website and her social media and things like that as well if you scroll up to the top of the chat. So thanks so much, Amanda, and thanks for everybody who joined us.
Thanks, everyone. It was lovely to be here. I hope you enjoy the rest of the festival.